Diving in Remote Destinations by Mike Gerken. Whether your plans involve recreational or technical diving, hiring diving operators in remote locations requires you to consider several factors. Like every type of diving, every dive site calls for specialized training and preparation. This article uses Chuck Lagoon in Micronesia as an example of how divers should ensure that their dive trips will be as safe as possible. Let's first consider the travel-related concerns. Divers should take care to rehydrate on and after their flights, and to rest before diving. Diving while fatigued can be especially dangerous, as divers must be able to maintain focus on buddy awareness, gear management, depth control, and buoyancy control. In the case of tech diving, it's even more complex, with switching gases and tracking partial pressures of oxygen. Reaching locations such as Chuck Lagoon can require as many as 4 flights, spanning several time zones over more than a day of travel. So travelers should consider arriving a day early to rest, rehydrate, and recover before getting into the water. A well-rested dive group will be more safe, the dives will be smoother, and they'll have much more fun. Informational concerns. One of the most important considerations of the dive operator is to provide specialized briefings to discuss the schedule and explain dive protocols and environmental risk factors. Divers will learn about average visibility, depth, water temperatures, and currents, as well as additional methods of navigating to and from wrecks. Every dive boat features a hang bar or a weighted hang line for divers to use while finishing decompression obligations and safety stops. And responsible dive operators will cover this information and provide extra gas from a regulator on deck for out-of-air or low-air situations. Reputable liveaboards will not only discuss this information in the dive briefing, but also provide their protocols for the booking. To choose the safest operators, do your homework beforehand and learn about their procedures. Before the dive, the liveaboard's dive operations manager will ask the dive teams about their plans and assign guides to the teams who want them. Each team should share what surface marker buoys they would deploy in emergency situations, how many tanks of nitrox or oxygen should be available via safety divers if necessary, and prior to the dive, the operator will also inform each team of the location and availability of tow lines and chase boats used to rescue overexerted lost divers at the surface. Take responsibility for your safety by making sure that both your team and the liveaboard crew have shared all the requisite information before you get in the water. What about the emergency responses? When planning a trip to a remote dive site, divers should research the availability of operational recompression chambers and quality health care. For example, Chuck Lagoon has one privately owned functional chamber, which is not always staffed because it relies on volunteers to operate it. As a result, dive operators at Chuck Lagoon have protocols for dealing with suspected cases of decompression sickness. Patients must go to the local hospital for examination, and only then, if the chamber is needed, then the staff members will be assembled to open the chamber. This issue is common for many isolated dive locales around the world. As soon as the dive operators suspect a case of decompression sickness, they should contact Divers Alert Network to open a case and to get advice. If a local chamber is not operational, Dan initiates medical evacuation and takes over. For dive incidents at Chuck Lagoon, air ambulances must fly several thousand miles from either the mainland United States or the Philippines to retrieve the patient, who will then be flown to Hawaii, Guam, or the Philippines, or whatever Dan deems the best treatment which will be available. It takes days to get there, in which case severe decompression sickness may result in serious disability. So divers should dive conservatively to mitigate the risk of severe decompression sickness. Increase your safety margin within no decompression limits. Breathe nitrox, ascend slowly, and extend your safety stop. Medical evacuation is very expensive, which is one of the reasons dive operators recommend that every diver should get dive cover, DAN membership, or dive insurance. What about training and preparation? Well, wreck diving is very popular in Chuck Lagoon and often involves penetration diving. The deeper the wreck, the more complex the dive becomes. Divers should never go beyond their training and abilities, and when entering a wreck, divers with poor finning techniques can cause silt outs, which is filling the water column with sediment, which can cause dangerously low visibility. While dive staff can offer tips and techniques to avoid this issue, it is paramount that divers ensure they receive all the necessary training and certification before leaving for their trip. The dive team should decide what gear they will use, how many backup lights to bring, who will lead the dive, and so on. Prudent divers will follow a dive guide for the complex portions of the penetration dive. Local guides have years of experience and are likely to know the wrecks and dive sites far better than any visitor, so rely on their expertise. Technical divers require additional dive equipment to complete their complex dive plans. Open circuit divers will use multiple tanks or side mount tanks. Rebreather divers require special diluent, oxygen tanks, and carbon dioxide absorbent. Most tech divers require decompression cylinders or bailout bottles to complete long decompression obligations. Traveling to remote destinations with all this gear can be an expensive and daunting task. To alleviate this issue, some operators have gear on site, but providing supplies and equipment to tech divers becomes more difficult in remote dive locations, such as Chuck Lagoon, which must rely on pre-established supply lines and acquire and maintain inventories. It is up to the divers to inquire about the availability, and it is up to the operators to ensure they can follow through. What about safety equipment? Any liveaboard worth their reputation should have ample equipment for specifically diving operations, but also more generally for any seagoing operation. The following supplies should always be on hand. Communication devices. Safe boating and diving in remote locations should require mobile phones, internet access, and, when available, satellite phones. If a diver should get injured, the operator must be able to immediately contact emergency medical services and DAN to expedite care. Communications devices are also vital for monitoring weather conditions and to allow time to prepare for severe weather. First aid supplies. Dive operators should not only have first aid kits, stretchers, and automated external defibrillators, that is AEDs, but should also have updated medical supplies. Items such as suture kits, medications, and IV kits may be helpful even if the crew is not medically trained. Doctors, nurses, and emergency medical technicians are often guests on board and can provide advanced care until hospital physicians can take over. For this reason, it is beneficial to know prior to beginning a charter who the passenger roster is and who's medically trained. Oxygen. First aid for any suspected case of decompression illness involves oxygen administration. Every dive boat or liveaboard must have at least one complete oxygen unit on board, which will include oxygen cylinders with enough oxygen to get the patient to the next level of care, along with either continuous flow or demand valve regulators. Well-prepared operators might have multiple units to care for more than one diver at a time. When it comes to safety, every diver considering a trip to a remote dive destination should consider whether the risk is worth the reward. Take the time to research your options and maintain high standards, not only for the dive operators, but also for your own training, equipment, discipline, and physical fitness. The best operations can provide the safest environment possible, but the individual diver and the smart decisions he or she makes will produce the safest and most fulfilling outcomes.